Hi, everybody. I'm Scott,
And I'm Luke.
And I'm Jonathan.
and this is the No Way to Hollywood podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for watching. Hopefully you like it.
Yeah, I know it's been hard with all these Google Hangout, Zoom videos coming out these days, but hey, we're trying.
That we are.
And I think we're doing pretty well.
Uh-oh. Okay, it's still there. Good. Tonight we are talking
The timing.
director's cut.
We're doing so well.
The timing of that was beautiful.
Well, tonight we're talking about director's cuts of movies and why we have them, why they're different, and kind of giving us some opinions on the process of filmmaking and the decisions that are made. So, guys, what are some movies you've seen that have director's cuts?
Wow. I've seen Kingdom of Heaven's 2 different cuts. Star Wars. I like to think of it as there is only one cut for Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. But, if you talk to George, there's this other cut, and that's the only cut. And so there's that. Lord of the Rings, which has the extended editions. They're not director's cuts exactly, but they're extended editions. I just watched Dr. Sleep's director's cut. And there's definitely Blade Runner is the notorious one for having like 25 different cuts. Apocalypse Now is another one.
And I would completely disagree with you that the extended editions of Lord of the Rings are director's cuts. I don't think they fit in this category at all, but we can talk about that in a minute. The one big director's cut that I saw, two, would be Amadeus and Crash. Both of which, when I watched the film originally, I liked it, for the most part, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But then the director's cut kind of ruined it. And so those are the two that stand out for me.
It's an interesting concept. To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure if I've actually watched any director's cuts of films unless I just happened to buy the DVD that was the director's cut without knowing it. And to be perfectly honest, I don't know. So we'll just go with nothing for now.
Wow.
Did I even say that the Lord of the Rings were director's cut? I said they were extended editions.
You did, but you put them in this podcast.
Well, they're extended, man. That's what I'm thinking about.
Needless to
that's
say,
the whole
it's
thing that you do.
Different than the theatrical release version.
True.
So, Luke, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you think these kind of cuts are produced for consumers to watch?
I'm not sure why they're produced for consumers to watch. Well, except for that it gives an opportunity to milk the cow again, right? Like, here's this film, and everybody went to see it, and then they bought the video. Here's a new version, right? So as far as why they're released, I think it's because it's an opportunity to make more money. There might be an argument that, like, here's the artist's original vision, but that's where I think this is weird, though, because extended editions or like the unrated edition or the version that has 30 more seconds of swearing, like, those are also like shameless cash grabs, right? So the director's edition is, in theory, giving us a different vision for the final product that allows fans of the film to partake in that and kind of get back into like the real version or something. That'd be my guess.
Well, this is where Blade Runner is a good example, because Blade Runner is actually, the cuts are actually director's cuts, as in the initial theatrical cut of the film had a lot of studio interference. For instance, the Blade Runner theatrical cut has Harrison Ford doing a lot of narration over a lot of the movie, and you can tell that Harrison Ford hates that he's doing that, because that was never the plan. That was a studio note that said, this movie doesn't make enough sense. You need to have a narration over it. So Harrison, someone write this up, and Harrison come in and do the dialogue, do the booth recordings and get it going. And we want a happy ending, so we're going to do a happy ending this way. And Ridley Scott never wanted that to happen that way. Now, I'm not saying his version is better, but I am saying that there is absolutely in that case at least, I want it to be this way. The studio wants it to be this way. And the movie that came out initially is the studio's version, not my version, the director's version. And so I finally got a chance to go back and make that version of the movie happen that I wanted to have happen. So I do know that that exists and that happens that way. But I do also agree that the director's cut as terminology, um, especially when you got to unrated and extended cuts, like you started to get to this place where, was it actually the director's cut? Was it the director's vision? Or is it that they just said, we actually have more footage we could put in here? We actually have another, we can sell this again. I mean, I think that's totally a valid thing to say. I don't know when it switched over. I'm not sure how much I buy. The terminology has been, what's the word? Tainted. So I'm not sure what is actually a director's cut anymore and what is just called a director's cut, but it's just, extended footage.
What was that film that they shot it and then the studio heads like took it over and like wrecked it, and so then the director gave them like 6 pages of notes on why they ruined his film? It was a famous one too. Give us it in the
Unfortunately, I
comments.
think that happens too often for me to know which film you're talking about.
No, it's like a really important famous one.
Well,
Maybe
with-
I'll figure it out.
While you're thinking about that, I did want to kind of comment on Jonathan's comments about Blade Runner and the voiceover that they did in the original theatrical cut, and then to take that out during the director's cut. Because for someone like myself that actually really dislikes voiceover and sees it as a crutch, it seems like it became that in the original Blade Runner theatrical release. So I can see in an instance like that where having that other cut might actually be a valuable tool, for instance, because, if I could, I'd rather see it without all the voiceover, to be perfectly honest.
And then there's the whole idea of like the Zack Snyder cut for like this movie that sucked, or like here's this latest edition of like Star Wars that we all wanted because here's a first script, that somebody wrote and they've animated it now. Like there are opportunities to say we don't like what the studio did, right? But the
Yeah.
studio has a responsibility to try and make this work for audiences, right? So there's kind of this tension, right? And this comes back to like art versus like business, and film is both, right? So you have to try and balance all of that. And so there is a tension there, and there is an opportunity by releasing multiple versions to kind of explore that for people who are interested.
Sure. That does kind of lead me into the curiosity of the two that you brought up, Luke, that you said ruined the movie for you. What exactly did those director's cuts do that ruined the movie for you?
Okay, so some spoilers for Amadeus and Crash. With Amadeus, when I saw the theatrical edition, I really understood Solieri. I was like, I get your tension and your frustration and your pain. So like, I'm with you and I get it. And it was probably also where I was in my life at the time spiritually. And so it really resonated. And then I watched the director's cut because I was like, oh man, I like this movie. Let me go try it. And they turned him into this licentious, awful person. And they added scenes where, okay, so in the original, he's like, God, why would you use a blithering idiot who's not a good person for your glory when all I want to do is serve you and you're not using me this way? So I was like, that's awesome. Great question. Right. But then in the director's edition, it's like, but he's actually a nasty person who really messes with people. And so you're like, I don't believe that you're a good person or even trying to be a good person. So your question completely falls apart, which is weird then, right? Because this is the director who made this movie and now he's undercutting his thesis in his film. So that was weird. And then in Crash, I enjoyed it mostly for the one scene, the one shot that's really good, the cape, right? Like that's awesome. And so then when I watched the director's cut, like there was just a lot more swearing and a lot more just nastiness. And it was like the movie already has enough of this stuff. You don't need to like pack it on within the interpersonal things for people personally. keep
Mhm.
it with the
Mhm.
connections and the disconnects and the bumping in with other people, not in their own life, right? So I
Sure.
felt like it just added on needlessly.
Yeah, and that I mean that gets back to one of those theories that I have about films that end up being rated R. For the most part, I tend to think that R means ruined, and you added too much of the stuff in there that you didn't need to have. Now there are exceptions to that rule, but it sounds like in Crash, the director's cut kind of took that and just kind of made it gratuitous, for lack of a better word.
I would agree personally with that assessment. Yep.
I mean, that's interesting. That's a whole other conversation. I'm just thinking that I wonder if the Amadeus director's cut issue, and that, I feel that way about Kingdom of Heaven as well. In a sense, well, not the same exact stuff, but I mean, potential spoilers for Kingdom of Heaven potentially. But I've seen that movie a bunch, the theatrical cut, and I enjoyed the theatrical cut. And it could just be that I liked the theatrical cut and I got used to it. So when I finally watched the director's cut, I just didn't like that it was new. And I'm gonna maybe try to watch that again someday. But I just remember the director's cut adding this entire subplot, or putting back in an entire subplot that made me find one of these characters despicable and change this thing and change that thing that I thought was awful. And I have to wonder if this is similar to, in my mind, to the George Lucas problem, which I talked about on another previous podcast, but a little bit, but just this idea of creator's actual intent kind of sucks or is very different than what you actually liked about the movie. So something came out, some product came out, and what you saw you really liked. And because it's not what the director had in mind, right? They did a director's cut, and the director's cut could be good, could be its own thing, but it's not what you liked about the movie. And so, since you liked this thing about the story and you liked this aspect and circumstance of the film, you don't like what the director was actually trying to do, which might have been this entirely other thing. And I wonder if some of that is running, some of these films are running into that problem where it's like, I never wanted to make the movie that you fell in love with. I wanted to make this other movie. It was this other idea that was, had all that stuff in it. But when you put it in different context and a different edit, it's, totally different things.
Right. And what's interesting about this and this question is something we've chatted about a little bit, but with film being such a collaborative art, you really need other people to push back on your ideas to make certain that stuff that you love is actually awesome. Or if it's not, or it doesn't help your film, cut it out. And so there is something in most cases where the studio heads or the editor coming in and saying, no, we're not doing that, actually helps the film. And the
Yeah, but
director coming back and saying, I'm going to do what I want to do, actually kind of ruins it, right? Like, because if George had said, I get to do whatever I want, then we get the prequels. But before that, you get
but
the good stuff, right?
but the funny thing is that like George Lucas had a screening of the original Star Wars without all the special effects done for Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola and like all these other great names of the time. And he's all his buddies. And he's like, get a screening for them. And the vast majority of them said, I don't get it. I don't like it. I don't know what you're doing. This is a screwed up thing. I don't like this is dumb. And the only person said it was any good was Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg's like, hey, that was pretty good. I think it'll be good. Keep going. And if lo and behold, Star Wars becomes Star Wars. Like, and that's the thing where it's like George Lucas has been on both sides of the coin. You've let, George Lucas has pushed forward and made this thing that everybody loves. And at the same time, George Lucas has pushed forward and made this thing that everybody hates. And you can argue that same, it took him being a director and saying, screw everybody, I'm going to push forward and make it happen to make some of the stuff that we love to exist. You can also argue that it took George Lucas pushing forward and just saying, screw everybody to get to a place where everything sucked. Like, I don't know where you go.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there is this idea in filmmaking where you have to love the project enough to deal with all the naysayers who say this movie's no good, or even yourself when you see your first edit and you're like, oh no, right? And that's where I love the shorts that I've made, but I also know where they really weren't good. But I also know where people brought their skill and they they brought stuff to the film that I never would have come up with, or my idea was actually bad, right? So like if I think of Applejack, I had this idea that the character was going to be a certain way, right? And then the actor showed up and he's like, well, this is the outfit that I have because I was going to play it this way, but is that what you want because your script said this other thing? And I was like, oh no, your idea is way better, right? And
Mm.
and so there is this give and take thing
Yep.
where the director has to push forward, but at the same time, you also have to take the input of other people and then be able to balance all that. And yeah, your point is well taken. George Lucas believed, but then he also like didn't have people who would push back hard enough or something, right? Like
Yeah,
I don't know.
And all of this question does kind of, or all of this talk does raise the question of, like, where should the creative control in a particular project be? I mean, is it? It has to start. I mean, without writers, you don't have a script. Without directors, you don't have the direction on the screen. Without actors who played a particular way, you don't have their ideas. Without editors piecing it together, you don't have that. Without producers saying no, this doesn't make sense, we need this instead. Like, where would you guys put creative control? Who should have it? And why should the people that have the control have the control?
I'd like to start by just giving what I think right now is the status quo, just to give an idea of what I think is currently happening, which is generally, especially in cinephile and artistic circles, people generally think that the director should have final cut of the film and have control. And I think that largely stems from, I mean, there's some good reasons for it, but I think you can trace that back to auteur theory, which is the theory of film criticism theory that though filmmaking is a collaborative art, there can be and there is a author, an auteur, a singular voice coming through the collaborative art, and that singular voice is the director, who is that is their voice coming through. Now, if you've worked in film, if you study it, if you understand, you start to understand that that can very well be true. It can also be a little misguided because there's so many people with so many great ideas, and when you've done something on an indie film with people, you realize just how many people and their ideas are on the screen. But that's where people tend to think, I think now should be. And the other thought is that there's two other things, and they kind of are the same thing, which is the studio gets final cut. So the person who put the money, the studio that puts up the money and owns everything ultimately, gets the right to say, I don't care what the director wants. We don't like this. We're going to cut this down and make it the way we think it should be for audiences. We're going to try to salvage it, maybe even, or we just really think we don't care what you wanted to do here. It'd be way better if it had a happy ending, Ridley Scott. Here's your happy ending for Blade Runner. We're going to do that. And studios are often made out to be awful because of that. And a lot of that modern wise is sort of the Disney Marvel stuff where it feels like films are being made by committee sometimes, right? It feels like there's a committee of people who have all the right market research and all the right things. Like, you need a joke here, here, and here. You need an action scene here, here, and here. You need a happy ending. You need a false resolution here. Like as if a committee or a survey or market research is the thing that is driving the film. And Disney in particular is being accused of that plenty. And that may or may not be true. And I think there are times where you can kind of feel that. Even, think of the Star Wars The Force Awakens. That movie compared to the original Star Wars, there's a ton of differences. But one of them is Star Wars The Force Awakens definitely has some of that by committee vibe. You need to have this joke here. You need to be doing this thing here. Even though maybe
it's almost by spreadsheet.
Right. Yeah, even though you maybe don't need any of it. And so I just wanted to say that, I think that's the current situation, is that it's either by committee, it's a studio saying we're just going to take control whether you like it or not, or it's a director. The director has final cut. Him and the editor are talking and they have final cut, and it's the director's vision, the director's choice. So that is often sort of the world that we're dealing with as far as who gets to have final say currently.
Okay, and my thesis is that if it's a movie made by a person, written, directed, edited, potentially, scored and produced, whatever, right? That person is probably the person who has final say in the film, right? Like a Robert Rodriguez film, like some of his earlier stuff, or you know, uh, people like that, where they're doing the whole thing. It's their film. But the other adage is that a film is made 3 times: when you write it, when you shoot it, and then when you edit it. And I think some of the best people at doing this, like Ryan Johnson, Star Wars and whatever happened there notwithstanding, you know, he very clearly sees, I wrote this, I shot this, and this is what we ultimately cut and what I needed to, make happen. Right. And that's great. For Brick, he has some stuff in the behind the scenes about that, and that's great. But if it's a movie that was written by someone, directed by somebody else, and then produced by, this other group, it's hard to say for me that the director needs to be the one who has that vision, because it was written by somebody else and it was done something else, right? So the director has to have a vision for the parts they are a part of, which includes editing and giving some input there. And so even if it's just your vision and you're going on tour and it's going to be yours, I think to be most successful, you have to listen to the input of your team. And I love the quote about, like, if you are the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. And for films, the director's job is to pull in all the best talent so that the best film gets made, right? So
Absolutely.
if it's just you, go get all the best people for it. So that's kind of my thesis on that.
I would suggest that's kind of, well, specifically your last statement there about it's your job to get the best talent in the room. That's not the director's job. That's actually a director producer thing. The producer is the one who has to actually get all the talent. And that makes me think about Kevin Feige or Feige. I forget which way you're supposed to say it, but he's the producer of all the Marvel films. And he is, if there is one singular voice that goes through all of the Marvel films, I do mean all of them, it's Kevin. Kevin's the one who did it because he's the idea guy, producer, involved with everybody creatively and logistically the entire way. And it's unprecedented because Marvel and the connected universe and all of that in filmmaking is unprecedented. But he, though never directing a single frame, is also a creative visionary pushing things forward the entire way, including stories. Though he's not writing, he's also the idea guy. He's also the one saying, well, this needs to connect to this needs to connect to this. I think we should do a story that's like this. And you can do whatever you want, but like this needs to get to here by the end of it. And some filmmakers like Edgar Wright have had issues with that and have fallen kind of pushed away from that and couldn't fall in line with the system, and others have thrived there. And there's this joke that Red Letter Media, for instance, does where they're like, the thing right now, I mean, they're totally right, which is the thing to do right now is indie filmmaker makes very singular vision movie that's, written, directed by very much their style, their movie that they made. And it's good. People like it. So you pick them up because they're cheap and they have a singular vision, and you take them and you put them in the Marvel machine and you make them have to do a story, and even the action scenes. Like, don't worry about the action scenes. We've got a team of people who will take care of that. Just put your style into this and get the scenes, directed and get that kind of finished. And then we'll have your vision, your style, your voice a little bit in this. But really, it's the corporate machine, or really, it's the Marvel machine still making the sausage, still making the movie. And so and the other thing with your statement, Luke, is this whole, like, and I struggle too with the auteur thing. I agree that, like, yeah, if you wrote and directed the movie, like, it's sort of like it is your movie. And I also think about producers and executives who, like, very much are in control of green lighting things and budget and how much time you have. And there's a certain level where they, like, literally own it. And they make the big decisions sometimes about what can and can happen. And they can fire directors, for instance, and change things. Like, is Kathleen Kennedy the one responsible for the new Star Wars trilogy? Well, she's the producer who was there for all the films. She's the one who was a part of firing decisions of directors and writers, right? Is she the one responsible? Or is it J.J. Abrams and Ryan Johnson and then J.J. Abrams again? Is it the screenwriters? Is it Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney? There's so many things at play, especially when you get into these bigger films where it's like, how do you start to not just blame, but who are the voices? Who is this voice? But you, like you said, you go to Ryan Johnson. And there's all the Ryan Johnson movies are very much Ryan Johnson movies, right? And that's where I feel like if you don't, you have to have somebody in the room who's in charge enough to say, I know everyone's saying things and I'm hearing you, I'm hearing all of you, but I'm ignoring everybody and we're doing this. Or I'm listening to you and not the rest of you. There's got to be somebody, because
Yes.
that happens, right? Like you've got to have somebody, and that can maybe change, but that's the whole thing. A director is basically the captain of the ship during production and post-production. So they may have not been there in writing, although often they are too. But they're, if they're there during production and they're there during post-production, and they are typically, not always, but typically able to say, we're doing this.
Right.
Then
So
it
so
kind of
are we
falls in them.
saying that the theatrical edition, the theatrical release is the executive producer's version, and a director's cut may be more along the line of what the director wanted, and the extended edition is whose? Like the teams?
Well,
That's
that's where we
it
should go
could
to
be
Lord of the Rings.
anyone,
That's where we
but
should go to Lord of the Rings, because Lord of the Rings is an extended edition, right? But is the theatrical cut or the extended edition Peter Jackson's version? And I don't know if he's ever said anything about it. I don't know if he's ever said like, "Oh, I prefer this version." So if I haven't, forgive me if I've missed that. But I am almost willing to bet that Peter Jackson's like, "Yeah, I like both versions."
Absolutely.
I
Well,
did
and it
the
was, you have a studio that was probably sitting there going, okay, we can't release a 3.5 hour movie into the
Right.
theater and actually have it do well. So we need to release something that's more 2.5 ish hours, maybe 3 at most, so that we can actually make some money in the theaters.
But what about
And
Return of the King? Even by Return of the King, after all those years of goo gobs of money coming in and all the success, they're not going to let him do his 4 hour cut, that version either.
I mean, that's more of the way they make money in the theater, though. It's
Right.
you're not making money on a 4 hour cut. That at that point, the statistics show that you actually don't make as much money as you would have if you had cut it down to something else. But
But
when you have,
definitely make more money by releasing the extended edition later.
exactly. And Luke, I want to get back to your point of the 3 different points in time where the movie is made, because I think that has a lot to say with what the answer to this is. And we've discussed all kinds of number of people, but you know, there is definitely a point in time with the script that the movie is made with the script. There is a point in time when the production is when that movie is made. And then ultimately, as you know, most of my film editing professors in college would say, hey, we're the last ones that actually get to make this movie, so it's really our movie. But all the time you're going to have someone, peeping in your ear saying, hey, what about this, or hey, what about that? And so I don't know, like, if you get good people that know how to do their job and let them do their job, you ultimately have probably 2, maybe 3 people that have that I made this part of the movie, the writer, director, editor. And ultimately the people with the money are the ones that say, well, this is what the movie's going to be.
I have a theory or a way to say something, maybe, which is that I would suggest and argue that it's the person who can, if there is one person, that's the first thing. If there is one person who's responsible for a movie and like gets to say it's their movie, I would argue that it's the person who's had the most amount of time with authority to make decisions with the movie, starting at the end when it was released backwards. So if you had it, so a director who comes in after a script's been written, but then makes decisions all the way through production and all the way through post-production, it's their movie at that point. The writer absolutely did a lot, but the writer's work can be butchered as far as the writer's concerned by that point, right? And an editor can come in, and if it's really that the production was troubled and had different directors or something going on, and the writer was only one guy and his whole thing was sort of scrapped by the director, or at least one of them, right? And you kind of go through that cycle. Well, then guess who it is? It's the editor potentially. But then we could potentially trump all of that if there's creative decisions being made consistently, is the producer. If there's one producer who's like, I like this script, and I want someone to make it, and I want someone to edit it the way I want it to be edited, and I want to get there, then it's their movie. That's my argument. Whoever's been there the longest, who saw it through release and had creative authority.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
And I the only other comment I'd make is for
you know, when you see people at the award shows, you've got all the different awards where people come up, and you've got the writing, you've got directing, and ultimately when you're talking about best movie, it's usually the producer that's standing up there making the speech. Occasionally, if you've got someone that's writing, directing, and producing, then they're the ones up there. But usually when you're talking best picture in general, it's the producer, and he's got a lot of responsibility to bring the rest of those positions together. But that being said, it really depends. It could be anyone. On that note, we are running close to the end of our show. Guys, what recommendations do you have for our viewers?
Okay. I'm you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna recommend Willow. Willow, my friends. Willow. Did I recommend that already once this podcast? Did I do that once already?
Quite possibly.
I don't
Quite
remember.
possibly.
You must like it enough to recommend it a second time, though.
I mean, yeah, it's a great movie. Here's another one I'll give you just in case. Netflix, Patriot Games. That's Harrison Ford in Patriot Games. This is a Tom Clancy novel, the Jack Ryan series, which maybe now you're like, Jack Ryan, isn't that show on Amazon? And yeah, you're right. That's the same character, the same property, but before that, there was the film adaptation that was done. Well, really, guys, it's The Hunt for October with Alec Baldwin, which is one of the best Tom Clancy book sort of adaptations and uses of that property and that character. But I'm recommending to you Patriot Games, which is actually kind of funny because it's a trilogy of movies. Was supposed to be. Alec Baldwin did Hunt for October and then just walked away and said, "I'm done. I'm not doing it anymore." You're like, okay. So they brought in Harrison Ford and did sort of a soft reboot with Patriot Games. Jack Ryan, still the same character. All this to say, the movie itself, Patriot Games, I find it enjoyable. Spoiler alert, Sean Bean's the villain in the movie, so you know where that goes. And it's a movie where they get the Jack Ryan character right in the sense of, I mean, they get action-y by the end and the beginning, and he is an ex-Marine, but like it's a movie where the superpower of Jack Ryan, and this is the way it should be, is he's an analyst. It's a movie about a guy who's an analyst, and that's a superpower. And I think it's a pretty solid movie. It's kind of fun to watch. So check that one out.
Cool. And I'm going to recommend Rocketeer because it's a blast. Lots of fun. And then given our discussion, we've talked about this movie in the past, but Rodarowski's Dune, like if you want to talk about a person gathering talent and being crazy enough to push a film, like that documentary is insane. So if you still haven't watched it, now would be a good time.
I second that wholeheartedly. That documentary is nutso in a wonderful way.
Well, my recommendations tonight are coming from the slight absurdity that I think we find ourselves in with the current situation in the world. So I am recommending Anna and the Apocalypse as my first movie, as well as Zombieland. These are two zombie comedy movies. Anna and the Apocalypse also ties in some musical elements to it, which are just delightful and fun. And even though it's a zombie movie and most people end up dead, it's still kind of fun to think about, like this concept of, well, what's going to happen when outbreak happens and everyone turns into a zombie. And thankfully we're not turning into zombies right now, but it's, given the current situation, it's fun to laugh at.
Yeah, we didn't know that apparently during the zombie apocalypse we'll all just be at home and that's it. Like there'll just be zombies walking around indoors, unable to get out. That's how it's gonna work.
Well, thanks everyone for watching. We hope that you enjoyed this and that you'll join us again next time. Bye.
That would be awesome.
Goodbye.